So in this video, we're going to be looking at simplifying rational expressions. And if you remember, rational expressions just mean it's something written like a fraction. The difference in this class than previous classes is your fractions are now going to have x's on the top and bottom, or variables on the top and bottom. So our steps to simplifying are factor, cancel. If you do not factor, you cannot cancel. So if it's not factorable, then it doesn't reduce. Now in the homework and in this class, every problem is going to be able to cancel. So if you factor it and nothing cancels, you factored wrong. Also remember that our methods to factoring out a greatest common factor, factor by grouping for four terms, factor with rainbow, which is 3 terms, and difference of squared 2 terms. So those were all outlined nicely on the flow chart in your OneNote folder, but just a reminder of the ways you can factor. So here's our first example. X squared plus x plus 9 over x squared minus x minus 12. So in Hawks, the directions would say to find the restrictions or find the restricted values. So restricted values come exclusively from where the denominator equals 0, because anything divided by 0 is undefined. So to find the restricted values, I'm going to take my denominator, in this case x squared minus x minus 12, and I'm going to actually set it equal to 0. Now it's 3 terms, so the only way we know how to solve quadratics, which quadratic has a little x squared, so the only way we know how to solve x squared is factoring. So the first thing I'm going to do, find 2 numbers that multiply to 1 times negative 12, or negative 12. So I've got 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. I need to find 2 of those that will add to negative 1. So if I do positive 3 and negative 4, when I combine those, that will be negative x. So then I'm going to carry down my negative 12 and carry down my x squared equals 0. Now I'm going to factor by grouping, factor out an x, left with x minus 4, carry down my sign. Second one has a 3 in common, x minus 4. So I'm going to write down what's being repeated, x minus 4, and then write down what's left over when I actually take out that x minus 4. Now I'm still solving, so I'm setting each piece equal to 0 by the 0 product property that we learned about in class, and I'll have x equals negative 3 and x equals 4. Now let's talk a little bit about the context of this. So remember, we are finding the restrictions. We're finding the values for which the denominator is 0. Restrictions or restricted values mean that they cannot access. They are problem areas, if you will. So when we actually type these things into Hawks, there will be x and then an equal with a slash through, which means not equal 4, comma, negative 3. Because if I were to plug in 4 or negative 3 way up here in my denominator, it would make that 0. So take a second, pause the video, and I want you to type in 4 squared minus 4 minus 12. Type that in your calculator, do it quickly in your head, pause the video. Alright, so now that you've done that, you can see that that equals 0, which would make some number on top a 0 on the bottom. It would make that undefined, which is why these are my restricted values. The same thing would happen with negative 3. You plug in negative 3, minus 12, and that would actually also be 0 as long as you plug in with those parentheses. Okay, so here's my second example. X squared plus 3x all over x squared plus 6x plus 9. So you'll notice that there are 2 steps or 2 parts. Step 1 or part 1 says reduce the rational expression to lowest terms. So really what that just means is simplify. I'm going to take this thing and I want to cancel some stuff out. Now, the only way that you can reduce fractions is by these steps. You have to factor first and then cancel. If you remember, we talked about in class kind of some common mistakes. Students will cross out those x squareds. You cannot cross out those x squareds because that is not a common factor. It is not being multiplied. So I need to factor. Well, on top, I can factor out a GCF of x. So I'm going to have x plus 3 on top. On the bottom, that is 3 terms, so it's rainbow. So I'm going to work off to the side to factor that thing. So I need 2 numbers that multiply to 1 times 9. So I've got 1 and 9 and 3 and 3. 2 of those that will actually add to 6. So I'm going to have 3x and 3x. Carry everything down. Factor by grouping. Got x plus 3. Bring out a 3. So write down what's being repeated. Write down the leftovers. So there is that denominator factored. Now that I have factored, that's step 1 over here on the left-hand side. Now that I have factored, now and only now can I cancel. So these have a common factor of x plus 3. So I'm going to cross those out because both of those are factors touching multiplication. So I am left with x over x plus 3. I cannot cancel these x's because those x's, the one on the bottom, is not a factor. It is not touching multiplication. So that is actually my final answer. X over x plus 3. Now in the second part, it asks me to find the restricted values. So a common mistake is students then use the simplified expression to find the restricted values. To find the restricted values, you must go all the way back to the question. So you have to go back to the denominator in the question. You cannot use the simplified denominator. So I'm going all the way back to this thing right here. And that is what I will use for the restrictions. So I'm going to set that denominator equal to 0. Now the good news is I've already factored it. That's that right there. So I don't need to refactor it unless you just want more practice. So I'm still solving. So it's x plus 3, x plus 3. Set each piece equal to 0. So notice I got 2 solutions of x equals negative 3 as my restricted values. So yes, it says x equal, but remember we are looking for the restricted values, which means the values that x cannot be with a slash through it. Now because you got the same value repeated, you only need to write down x equals negative, or x cannot equal negative 3 one time. You do not need to write down negative 3, comma, negative 3. So that is your final answer.